Vamos a hacer la primera llamada a la doctora María Teresa Martínez. No te preocupes, que no sé, que a mí no me gustan las cosas. Compañeras y compañeros invitados, que nos vayamos acomodando, por favor, para ver si comenzamos la actividad pautada para el día de hoy. Y agradecerle a todos los que fueron puntuales, la puntualidad. Yo sé que no ha sido un día fácil, ha habido muchos problemas de tráfico, ha habido muchos problemas de la lluvia, no nos ha ayudado, pero nada. Pues vamos a pedirle a la doctora María Teresa Martínez que a nombre de la institución inicie formalmente la actividad.
Bueno, muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Bienvenidos a la Universidad del Sagrado Corazón. Nos place estar iniciando esta sesión académica y el 2011 con una actividad muy interesante que vamos a estar compartiendo. Bienvenidos a los que están aquí en la sala y a los que nos están viendo en la transmisión en vivo y los que después la verán en repetición. Durante este año académico estamos celebrando los 25 años de 3 de las maestrías que iniciaron el proyecto graduado de esta universidad. Gerencias de sistemas de información, relaciones públicas y sistemas de instrucción y tecnología educativa. Estas 3 maestrías tienen un elemento en común, y es el desarrollo de un manejo ético de los medios, particularmente las tecnologías de información y comunicación, tanto en el área de la comunicación como en el área de la educación y evidentemente en el área de sistemas. Esto es una preocupación, esto es un deber y esto es una de nuestras misiones dentro de la universidad. Para nosotros es entonces muy importante tener este tipo de actividad donde nos fortalecemos dentro de la academia y fuera de la academia. Sé que muchos de ustedes, algunos son egresados de nuestra universidad y otros son profesionales del campo, así que de verdad es un honor tenerlos acá. Quisiera excusar al doctor José Jaime Rivera, presidente de la universidad, y a la doctora Lidia Espinet, decana de Asuntos Académicos y Estudiantiles, que no pueden estar con nosotros esta mañana, pero les envían un saludo cordial. Además, quiero agradecer a la compañía Sprint, que es uno de nuestros auspiciadores durante la mañana de hoy. Nuevamente, bienvenidos a esta casa y los dejo con la licenciada Carmen Cintrón para que nos presente a nuestro invitado especial, el doctor Turner.
Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Reitero la bienvenida de nuestra decana asociada de asuntos graduados, programas graduados, estudios graduados, y quiero extenderle un saludo especial. De hecho, ya lo habíamos hecho informalmente afuera, a todos los exalumnos de tanto el programa de maestría en gerencia de sistemas como el programa de auditoría en sistemas, al igual que los alumnos de ambos programas que están hoy con nosotros, y así también a todos los invitados y público externo que nos acompaña hoy. Para nosotros es un gran placer, por 4º año, tener en Puerto Rico, en la Universidad del Sagrado Corazón, al doctor Javier Turner, que lo conocemos ya hace como 7 años más o menos, de lides académicas auspiciadas inicialmente por el consorcio de bibliotecas COBIMET. Así es que el doctor Javier Turner ha colaborado con esta y varias instituciones en Puerto Rico en esos 7 años en ayudarnos a conocer mejor el mundo de las redes y la seguridad de las redes. Y en un momento dado, cuando estábamos dándole forma a una nueva maestría, la maestría en auditoría de sistemas, dialogamos con él sobre la posibilidad de ofrecer un curso de investigación forense, Computer Forensics, que ha sido realmente un éxito, no solamente en términos de lo que ha aportado a la formación de nuestros estudiantes, sino también que la misma entidades evaluadoras, cuando vinieron, le dieron el reconocimiento a la institución por haber integrado esa temática tan pronto en una maestría innovadora como fue la maestría en auditoría de sistemas. El doctor Javier Turner estudió física primero en México, su país natal, y luego en los Estados Unidos. Es egresado del Chicago Institute of Technology, una de las instituciones más prestigiosas en las áreas de investigación en ciencia, y lleva más de 8 o 10 años trabajando en la Universidad de California en San Bernardino. Fue su primer oficial de seguridad y recién acaban de designarlo vicepresidente asociado del área de IT. Así es que, como decía nuestra decana, el doctor Turner es de la casa, así que sin más los dejo con Javier Turner. Buenos días.
Muchas gracias, buenos días. Permítame lo del micrófono. Antes que nada, déjenme agradecerle muchísimo a la licenciada Cintrón, a Sagrado, por estos años que hemos estado colaborando, la oportunidad de colaborar con ustedes, y sobre todo por el honor de estar aquí en esta celebración tan importante que es para Sagrado, en su celebración de los 25 años de su maestría. Es increíble cómo el tiempo ha pasado y sigue pasando, y se da uno cuenta de cómo la tecnología sigue evolucionando, cómo los programas siguen cambiando, y de la dinámica tan grande que pasan por los cursos académicos, sobre todo de maestría, y los esfuerzos de las instituciones por tratar de mantener a sus egresados al día, no nada más en los cambios de tecnología, pero también en los cambios sociales. Porque si ha habido algo que la tecnología nos ha mostrado en los últimos 10 años, es unos cambios sociales tremendos que los podemos observar todos los días con los estudiantes que se ven en las universidades. Cada generación trae nuevas expectativas de las universidades, y el tratar de mantenerse a nivel de esas expectativas es un reto para todas las instituciones. En fin, muchísimas gracias, y vamos a empezar. La licenciada Cintrón me pidió que hiciéramos, quizás podríamos hacer unas presentaciones acerca de investigaciones digitales, investigaciones forenses, pero más que nada darles a ustedes una perspectiva que no sea necesariamente desde el punto de vista técnico, pero que sea una perspectiva ligeramente diferente acerca de qué realmente son las investigaciones forenses o investigaciones digitales. Entonces, vamos a empezar por esto, así que ok. Ahí está la presentación, ahí está. Es esa. Sí. Acuérdate que todo salió en la televisión. Ok. Bueno, ya que tenemos audiencia que nos está viendo en vivo y no sabemos dónde viene, voy a tratar de dar la presentación en inglés. Espero que todos la acepten de esa manera, y por favor acepten el acento también. Bueno, again, good morning, and thank you everyone for letting me be part of this celebration in Sagrado. Licenciada Cintrón, thank you very much again. So let us start with something that I think that all of you are interested in learning, or they're curious about it because it's everywhere. And that one is about digital investigations. So what's happening with technology, what we're doing with technology. So for today, okay, the agenda for today is a little bit ambitious. So we're going to be looking at 4 major topics. One is, what are really digital investigations? So we're going to have an overview of that. The overview is going to also to give you a perspective of the flavor of the course that is being offered here in Sagrado in digital investigations. The other one is developing a digital investigations program is more towards institutions. How does an organization, not necessarily Sagrado, but how does an organization can establish or can plan in order to implement digital investigations within their infrastructure in order to address some of the issues of security? because everything, one of the main issues, main concerns that we have with the networks is security, or resources is security. So we're going to try to address that. There is another interesting topic that, are you ready for e-discovery? And what is e-discovery? There are similar types of laws that are coming, federal laws. And the question is, as an organization, are we getting ready for that? Are we prepared to deal with the legal implications that they're being imposed on the digital, on the cyberspace? Can we deal with them? Are we prepared to deal with them? So this is going to be a discussion on that. And the other one is, what are the challenges that then we see in digital investigations? How the landscape is changing in view of many of the other technologies that are coming up and that we're seeing, and how can we adapt ourselves to deal with those changes, both from the organizational perspective and also from the perspective of the investigator. How do we prepare ourselves in order to keep up with all the changes that are taking place? So, please don't feel that then you cannot ask questions. Feel free to ask questions. I hope this is going to be a very dynamic presentation. For those of you that know me, it's very difficult for me to stand still. So I will try not to move too much. All right, okay. Digital investigations, why are we doing digital investigations? I think if you start looking at the reasons why we're doing it and when we started to do that, one of those ones is basically security incidents. Our goal for doing investigations, and that's how we started at the university, was to try to improve the detection and prevention of inappropriate use or the damage of information systems. You get viruses, you get attacks, and then you need to understand, how did that happen? When did it happen? And how can you prevent that one from happening again? And the only way to do that is if you go back and then take a look at the incident itself, and then you try to analyze the incident, and then you try to learn from them. And that one is how most of the digital investigations started. The other one that is becoming more common is on the workplace. Some of the issues that then we started to see is harassment, information theft, the inappropriate use of resources from an organization. And that's one of the other areas where digital investigations have started to play an important role. All of you have heard about email analysis, what people send, who do they send it to, and they go back and they try to extract information, or what sites do they visit, and that one is all over the news. So it is becoming more common, that type of activities on the workplace. The other one that it has been there for some time is all the legal aspect of it, the criminal prosecution and litigation. It's now started to become also important. Well, it has been doing it for a couple of years, but now it's playing a much more important role, more dominant role, because individuals are using the internet, individuals are using communication systems for all types of activities, and is through the investigations, digital investigations, and all of that information that is circulating, that the law enforcement is able then to capture or to obtain evidence that then they can use, both to defend or to accuse an individual, to support whatever side you are into. Now, digital forensics is a digital investigation. But we need to understand that when the scientific study of digital data becomes a forensic discipline, when it relates to an investigation or prosecution of a crime. Now, does that mean that just because then we're doing an investigation that is not related to a crime is not forensic? No. What we want to make sure is that we do investigations, that all the investigations that then we do it within a particular framework. And that framework is the framework that is provided by the forensic sciences. The forensic sciences applies to many areas. There are very strict principles, it's a framework that it guarantees or no guarantees, but tries to guarantee or ensures that data of information that then you're presenting, the way that then you're collecting it, that you're preserving the data, and the way that then you analyze the data, that you do it without modifying the data, without introducing changes, trying to preserve the integrity and many of the other characteristics of the data. So the forensic science, what they're giving us, is not necessarily for data, but the forensic sciences applies to many other disciplines. And you have heard that forensic science will apply to in medicine. But forensic science apply also to accidents, right? People use forensic sciences when an airplane crashes. People use forensic sciences when they try to analyze a car accident. So every time that you have an incident and that you have something, if you want to conduct an investigation, and that investigation has to be a scientific investigation so that it's not biased, then you need to follow certain principles. And those are the principles provided by that framework, the forensic sciences. So what I wanted to do here is explain a little bit more about that methodology, not necessarily about the tools, although there's many tools, but as you know, the tools keep changing. It's one of the challenges we're going to be talking later in the afternoon, right? But what is the methodology that then we need to follow if we want to do a digital investigation? To begin with, I think that then you need to realize that in any one of the other cases where you do an investigation, you never know if it's going to end up on a legal court or not. So, in principle, what you need to do is always do all your digital investigations, right, following a forensic framework. So, in reality, well, every digital investigation becomes what? A forensic investigation, or at least you had to follow those principles. So, organizations, where they try to conduct that type of investigations, they always follow those principles, and that is why in many areas or in many universities, the course or the discipline is called forensic investigations. Although there's many in which you never ended up in court, but you never know when you want to end up in court, and that's a problem. So what is the methodology? The methodology, the first thing you need to do is you need to identify and locate all your sources of evidence. In the case that then we're dealing with information systems, data, where are those sources of information? Where can you find them? And if you look around of all the devices that then you have, in case that there is an incident, you have information on your phone, you have information on your email, you have information on the GPS, you have information on your car. Every time that then you drive through the toll, there is information every time that then you get to your office, and then you use something to open a door, and then you use an electronic device. There is a lot of places where there is information. Within an organization, you can find information also everywhere. Every time that then you log in the computer, there's places that one is maintained. The information is retained a little bit on your computer. Information is retained in other systems that are not necessarily on your computer. So can you identify all of those places where the information resides, and that then you can extract it or that you can use it for a particular incident? Once that then you identify it, how do you preserve it? Digital information likes to be free and fly and change. Meaning what? That if you have an incident that happened this morning, and let's say that it's on your computer, and someone needs to collect that data, your computer is not waiting for the investigator to come, right, and try to extract that information. Your computer continues running, and your computer has processes and many things. And not only that, a server is the same issue. So whatever evidence was there of a particular activity, that evidence may start to deteriorate, right? Just because the natural process of information. So the once that then you find it, and once that then you're able to identify what it is, and now you had to preserve it, there has to be a way that then you can preserve it without changing any more that information and prevent it from changing. The responsibility, you say, it is, how long do I need to preserve that information? Well, that's another challenge. if you start an investigation now and that investigation is going to take you for another 3, 4, 5 years and there is a legal consequence of that, that may be 7 years. Now, what happened with technology in 7 years? Changes. So if I had stored that information on a floppy, how many of you have a floppy reader? And how do you know that I can read it after 7 years, right? How do I need to preserve the media? So there's a lot of interesting issues within the preservation of evidence. It's not that simple. It involves a lot of things, right? The other part that is also interesting is the other stage is the examination, right? Once that then you collect, one that you identify, you preserve the information. Then the other part of the process on the digital investigation is the examination of all the evidence, the examination of all pieces of data that then you collected, and try to make sense out of that. And that one takes you to analysis and reconstruction, right? And the final stage out of an investigation is what? The reporting. And I think that that's one that everyone hates. What? This bureaucracy? No, it's writing, it's typing, it's having to make sense and try to make sure that what you're writing is understandable, that it makes sense, that is consistent, right? So, but in general, that means those ones are the main parts of the methodology that an investigator will follow. By the way, an investigator may not necessarily be involved in all of them. Why? We will see that one in a minute. But before that, what is digital evidence? Sorry, you have data. You have a piece of data, right? What makes it an evidence? So if you want to look at that one, what makes a piece of information evidence? And there is a couple aspects of that. And one of those ones is, the authenticity of the data. You need to prove that it's authentic, that it originated from the source that then you were trying to collect, that is the one where it was generated. And the courts are defining, for that purpose, they're defining what is something that is called authentic. There's a criteria for that. You also need to verify that if that one was self-generated, that all of those processes that generate that data, that piece of evidence, right, that whatever generated is working properly. You say, what do you mean by that? Yes, every time that then you log into a computer, the computer then records what you did or records something. Is that thing working correctly? Why? Because if you want to use that information as evidence, you need to demonstrate that it was working properly, right? That there was nothing mysterious about it, that there is that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, that timestamps are always placed correctly, that it knows exactly, that means that the information that is put in there, that is writing, that is accurate. The other one is the integrity of the integrity. You need to demonstrate that data has not been changed, modified, or altered once that then you obtain it. That may sound like a simple principle, but it's not. Trying to ensure that once that then you collect something has not changed during the process of collection. All right? It's not so much that you say, well, it's not changed, hasn't changed. I'm looking at it, it hasn't changed. But now you try to collect that piece of information and you try to ensure that whatever you got, whatever process that then you follow in order to collect that information, that the process itself has not changed the information, has not changed the data. So that means that qualifies about the integrity of the data. The other one is the reliability of the data. And that one is that any extraneous information to the digital data, that they're accurate. For example, when you extract information out of your computer, when was that you write a file, and as soon as then you write a file, you save the file. There is a date that is associated with the time in which you save the file, right? You want to make sure that that data is accurate. How do you know that they're accurate? Well, it's accurate, or it's as accurate as the clock on the computer, right? If that clock is off, right, then the time may be off, right? Now, the system may be accurate, but it not be precise, correct? So the thing that then you want is accuracy, meaning that you write it, that is proper, right? The precision, meaning it's the right time, right? Okay. Is something that then you had to worry later. So any piece of evidence that then you collect, or sorry, any piece of information, digital information that then you collect, if you want to use it as evidence, you need to ensure that it meets that criteria. Doesn't matter what it is. If you cannot meet that criteria, then guess what? You cannot use as evidence. You may use it for many other things, but you may not be able to use it as evidence for something, correct? During the methodology, let's go back. Identification and location of digital evidence. There is something that is also very interesting, that is the, you need to maintain chain of custody. What does that mean? What that means is that then you need to know every step through which that data went through. Who got it, who used it, who extracted, who touched it, who did anything to it. You need to record that at every given stage. Trying to maintain detailed records of everything that is happening is something that is very important. And from the perspective of the investigator, every time that someone is collecting any information, what is the thing that people need to do? They need to write everything they do, right? You need to maintain accurate records of everything that is happening and everything that you're doing or somebody else is doing with that information. When you collect, and that's what happened in many cases, that the person that collects evidence may not be necessarily the person that is going to do the investigation. Why? Because first responders are the ones that they usually are the first to arrive into a location where an incident appears. In the case of a computer, who may be the first responder? The system administrator. He is the one that identifies the incident. He's the one that arrives to the computer, and he is the one that is the first to do something, right, with that information before they call the security office or before they call any one of the other entities, right? And they escalate the incident for an investigation. What happened during that time? And when that individual arrives and gets that piece of information, right? What did it happen? Did the individual recorded everything that any did? Because that one is important, right? So in some cases, you don't have the luxury as the investigator to be the first one to go and collect the data. So there has to be, from the beginning, there has to be a way to maintain that chain of custody. And you want to make sure that whatever happened, no one modified the data. Even if you collect the data, right, and you follow certain protocol for the collection of the data, and you give it to somebody else, right, you need also to sign up, and then it has to be a record of who signed it and at what time and many other things, because that one is that in case that there is a questioning about the integrity of the data, then you can start going to the chain of custody. You need to identify all of those possible areas, right, or all volatile data. There is data that deteriorates very fast. There's data that disappears. If you're dealing with an incident like it's a monitor, someone is looking at something, as soon as then you turn off the computer, that thing may be gone, right? You may be able to find something else, but you never know. There is attacks that happen on systems in which the attacks reside only in what is called the RAM, right? They're not written anywhere in your disk. They're not anywhere else, but they're running while the computer is running, and as soon as then you stop the computer, that process disappears. So you have to be careful when you're collecting data in a particular incident that that information has not disappeared. And how do you collect that? That one is also a critical piece. Secure physical evidence containing digital evidence. In some cases, that's possible. It's becoming more and more difficult to do that. In particular, if you have large systems, data systems, right? I don't think that they will allow you to get a server where all the, that is running the program for registration at a university, you cannot take it. And they say, oh, let's turn it off for a couple days to do the investigation. So in many instances, depends on the type of incident that you're doing, you will not be able to collect the physical evidence. In some cases, you are. If you're doing an investigation in a workstation, you may be able to retain the disk drive, you may be able to retain a camera, you may be able to retain flash drives, right? And then that one is the physical evidence, and from there is the physical evidence that may be containing the digital information. The other one is you better follow accepted protocols, all right? Again, if you want to make sure that whatever you do is going to meet the criteria to be qualified as evidence, you better follow certain very strict protocols, right? To ensure that to ensure the authenticity, to ensure the integrity of that data, right? And that one is in every stage. Remember, that one is something that you need to do at every stage of the process. So once that then you identified and then you locate, to do all of that, and now is the preservation. Again, ensuring integrity and following all the accepted methods and tools to ensure integrity. You can say, he's talking about preservation over and over and over again. Why? Because believe it or not, that's the part that many people fail to follow. If there is an area where people can find loopholes, or they can find holes in an investigation, is during the process of preservation of the data. The process of collection and preservation is probably the most important, because if you fail there, a lot of things cannot follow from that, right? You lose a big part of your investigation. The examination of digital data. Once that then you collect it, you had to follow other steps if you want to do the examination of that data. There are well-known methods, and people have proved that, or they have already demonstrated that you can make a copy of the data, right, and use that copy. And there's a way to do a copy of data that then you can use it in order to do an investigation. It has to be what is called a forensic copy. What is a forensic copy? It's a copy that maintains what? The integrity of the data, that nothing changes when you replicate the information. And there are a particular set of tools that allows you to do that, right? Once that then you do that, then you can start looking at the data, and then you can start doing an examination of the data. One of the things is the recovery of data that it may have been lost, that is hidden, right? Or it has been deleted. All of you have heard about that, that if you take a hard drive, even if you delete something, that something may still be there, right? The information may not be directly accessible to you, but the information resides somewhere on your hard drive. So someone that has the right tools and someone that made the right copy, digital copy, can, at any given time, can go in there and look for that information. Now, certainly you may be able to extract some information out of it. There is some information that it will be lost. Anytime that then you extract information out of that, there's some information that will be lost. But there is a lot of information that it still remains. And through correlation and through other type of analysis, you can make a case of where that information may have come from or how the information was used. Harvesting of digital data. That's an interesting aspect of it, because then you try to gather data and collect metadata. So what is metadata? Metadata is data about data. So what? Yes. When you write a document in Word on your computer, there is a lot of other information that is attached to that document other than the content of the document itself. Like what? The time that it was created, the last time that then you printed it, the last time that then you access it, or right? The last time you modified the file. Where was the original file stored? That's also part of it. So there is a lot of information that is on those documents. And the same thing happens in almost everything. How many of you have taken a picture with your digital camera, and then if you look at the information that it contains, you will find out that it has information about the date, the time. It has also information about the camera that it used. It has information. If you have a GPS, it tells you the location of where you were when you took the picture. It tells you all kinds of interesting pieces of information in there, right? You can even get the brand of the camera that it was used in order to take that picture. And if you're clever enough, you can also get the serial number of the camera that it was used. All of that information is on every picture. Now, of course, when you display the pictures, you don't see that, right? But it's part of the data that describes the picture. That information is called metadata. So your emails contain a tremendous amount of metadata that is not only the content of your email, but it's also a lot of the characteristics of the email, where it went through, who delivered it, through which system it was delivered, at what time it was delivered, from what account it was delivered. So there's a lot of interesting information on the email. So the process of harvesting information, right, is, of course, it has to be done within the scope of the investigation. And what is what you're really looking for? But that can take some significant amount of time, depending on the amount of data that then you're looking at, right? Sorting, organize, and classify your data. Okay, we lost battery. All right, but that's okay. So, where were we? Yes. When you're sorting information, you're organizing and classifying. Let me just tell you that when you do an investigation, yes, yes. Yes. Correct, including logs, activity logs, transactional logs. It all depends on the case that then you're dealing with. But again, you had to go to the process of making sure that whatever information you're submitting meets the criteria of digital evidence, right? But yes, everything is possible. Every piece of information is possible if it's relevant, right? One of the things that then you probably are wondering, say, well, how much data are we talking about? In case that you look at a hard drive of an individual, it usually has what? 250 gigabytes. If someone has 5 megs of email in their mailboxes, trying to go to 5 megs is not easy. So it takes a long time, right, to do analysis depending on the type of case that you're doing. And if you're doing in an organization where that one is a large number of individuals that they were involved, then the amount of data is also huge. So the process of sorting, organizing, and classifying that data becomes one of the most important tasks. How are you going to do it? One of the other part that then you also need to always be aware of is, how do you know that then you missed something? So, yeah, you can go and then use tools, you can go through the process, but you always have to remember, you always have to keep in the back of your mind, did I miss anything? Because when you're dealing with large amounts of data, then you use tools to analyze the data, you use tools to extract some of that information. And if you didn't design your criteria well enough, you may be missing something important. So one of the things that then you always do is to try to look back and make sure that then you really collected everything. The reduction of digital data, you select the data that is related to the scope of the investigation, and then you try to identify and search for additional digital evidence. The process is that once that then you select data that is related to the scope of the investigation, you also need to make sure that are you discriminating or are you eliminating data that probably you may want it later. So you have to be careful of how do you select those criteria and how do you document those criteria every time. Because then probably you find another piece of information and now you had to go back and then see, did you already eliminate that data based on that criteria? And if you did, now you had to go back and try to recuperate that data, incorporate it do another analysis, right? And incorporate it as part of your investigation. The analysis of the data. Now you have humongous amount of information, tons of information, okay? And now it's going to be up to you to start trying to make some sense out of that information, right? Which it may not be that simple. So you need to start assessing the digital evidence, both within the content and in the context of the investigation that then you were doing. One of the things that people use all the time is making hypotheses of something that they may happen or that it could have happened, right? And then you test those hypotheses with your data, right? In other words, you try to say, what will this happen? And if this has happened, what will have been the consequence? And then you try to validate, and then you have constantly a process that then you're testing and revalidating all the data that then you're doing on your analysis. One of the things that you had to be careful is the preconception idea. That means that you try to eliminate any preconceived ideas of what it will happen with the data. Otherwise, then you lose objectivity on the investigation. Correlation and causality. That's when you start with the process of, all right. That's when you start with the process to correlate the data, right? Both the one that then you have, the digital evidence with physical evidence, or that when you start to correlate digital evidence with other digital evidence. So it's the process of correlation, because then you're trying to create some form of, try to create a picture of what maybe had happened. Even though that one is also a formal part of the reconstruction of the incident, I don't think that then you can stop not trying to do it at different stages of the investigation. It's a logical process, right? It's how eliminate or how do we find new things on, we discover new evidence, or we think about new ways to look at the information and try to find out other pieces of evidence. And so the creativity, right, runs during all that process, and is when you start reconstructing and trying to find out, having an understanding of what happened. Causality, that's cause and effect. That one is one of the ways that then you try to test to see if the evidence is consistent. It's not unusual when someone hacks into a computer, someone penetrates a computer, that once that they have done something, they try to delete their footprint. They try to delete any traces that they were there. And sometimes you find within the process, and they say, oh, something interesting. I have a date in which a file is deleted, but I have another date that it was a later date in which the file was created or it was transferred into the system. So there is an inconsistency. How could you have deleted a file that it wasn't there to begin with, right? One happened at a time when the file wasn't there yet. So analysis like that is one that allows you to test whether the evidence that then you have or some of the information that then you have is consistent. And if it's not, it gives you some additional information. It gives you some other ideas of what may have happened. Validation, the process of corroborating evidence. The fact that you may have a piece of evidence or something that is an evidence may not be necessarily to reach a conclusion, right? In most cases, it's not. In most cases, what then you need is more than one piece of information that they will corroborate something. Two things corroborate each other. If something happened, then you can find two independent sources of evidence, right, that they point towards the same direction. One is corroborating the other. And that one has much more weight than one single statement, agree, or one piece of evidence. So the process of validation is a process that then you are constantly looking for. Can I validate every piece of information or evidence that I find? Can I find independent sources of information that it will allow me to validate a particular activity that it took place? And that's what you have, and you say, well, where is all your evidence? When you try to identify all your sources, you probably identify more than one source. There's a large number of sources, and it's through them that then you try to find information that you validate something, the reconstruction of the incident, right, using the digital evidence. And some people, and in some areas where they say this, and now you don't do the reconstruction until you complete the analysis and all of that. But it's part of the process of the analysis, of the investigation, to try to find out what happened. You're always curious about what happened, right? And it's not unusual for people to take the digital information that you have and try to infer behavior from there. And of course, you can go much more on that. And there's people that they dedicate their lives to that when there's criminologists, and that's usually what happens in law enforcement, that people try to get a lot more in terms of behavior of the criminal, the victimology, and all of that part, right? That, although it's applicable in law enforcement, you can apply to many things. The process of the digital investigation itself is, since it's very scientific, right, it's very objective. And once that you try to infer behavior, then you start going into areas that they may not be necessarily as objective as you may want it to be. But it allows you the reconstruction, it allows you to look for additional leads, it gives you pointers where there may be other sources of information. Because then you try to understand what really happened and what caused the incident or originate the incident. It also assists in obtaining understanding how the different pieces of evidence may be related. If you don't go to that process of trying to reconstruct what happened, right, it's very difficult to think in the abstract. So you don't. So you try always to relate all of them. It allows you also to focus the investigation and make future inquiries about other things that they may have happened, right? Things that they may haven't thought about it. Once that then you find some pieces of evidence, once that then you start putting those pieces of evidence together, it may lead you to other aspects of other areas where you may want to go and look for evidence, areas that you may have not considered before. And it can always assist you in locating concealed evidence, right? In the area that then we work on the university, when you have someone that is looking, that he went through your system, do you think that that individual is going to leave the evidence you're laying around? More likely is not. So they take significant steps to what? To hide, to change or to modify, to do something with the evidence, right? And if you have an idea of what is taking place or what it may have taken place, that may give you some leads on how can you discover evidence that other ones may be hidden from view. What is the kind of things that you use during the incident and the reconstruction of an incident? One of those ones is sequence of events, right? Time sequences. You try to determine locations and paths, and then you also try to establish directions and duration of events. So all of that information, then you start putting now timelines of when things happen, how things happen, where do they came from, right? In some cases, you may be finding information about different IP addresses or different locations where the when you see activity coming from, right? How long do they wear on a particular system? Do they came to this system, they stayed there, they went to another system, right? All of that one is, all those timelines allows you to get a better picture of what happened with the incident and try to reconstruct really what happened. During the process of reconstruction, you can also go through the process of reclassification of some of the information. And then you start to try to classify slightly different. One is relational. How pieces of evidence are related to each other. Who, the what, the where do they come from, right? Do they come from the same? Are they related to a particular IP address or particular individual? In many cases, we don't know the names of the individuals, right? Not on the case that then we deal with on incidents on the computers. You're being attacked from everywhere, so you don't know the name of the attacker. You only know what? An IP address, or you only know something like that, right? Functional. This little piece of classification This is when you start looking at particular tools. When someone comes into your system and downloads a piece of software, and then you're always concerned, did they use that software to do something if you don't see any evidence of anything else, or you were not able to collect something, right? That's usually what happened with a rootkit. What is what it did? And in some cases, what you do is that then you try to see how that rootkit or how that type of software works, right? Functionally, what is the function of that, in order to get more ideas or to get some leads about what it may have happened, or how do they use it? What was the purpose of certain things? For example, do you know the purpose of every virus that it comes to your computer? Well, in some cases you do, in some cases you don't. And one of the work that people does all the time is try to identify what a particular virus is doing, or a particular worm is doing. What is its functionality, right? So once that you have it on your computer, what is really doing? If it's something new, no one has classified it, then, ooh, welcome, you're the first. Isn't that, don't you feel lucky? So, right, now you can do the analysis and then help everybody else to tell them what is that piece is doing. In some cases, some of the ones are specifically designed to look for credit card numbers. Some of them are specifically designed to look for personal identifiable information, right? Some of those ones are specifically designed to capture everything that then you type on the keyboard. Every character that then you type, they capture it and they send it somewhere else. So every one of those has a slightly different functionality. So when you discover something, you always ask yourself, how does it work, right? And that's part of the functional analysis. Temporal analysis is how events are associated in time, right? And remember one thing, in many of the incidents, at least the ones that then we deal with, incidents happen from different time zones. So where the computer originates, and that one is also possible that within one of your particular investigations, you probably collect information to common efforts that they may originate from different locations, right? Different time zones. You had to be aware of what is taking place, right? And it's not rare that people make mistakes because they didn't take in consideration some of the issues associated with time zones. So just be aware of that. One of the things that it also help you to reconstruct the incident is to try to get some idea about the intent. Were you targeted or you were random? Now, which one is the one you prefer for you? Well, you like to be random, right? That means because then a random attack means that, yeah, you were not really targeted for anything. You were not singled out of everything else. But if you are one of those entities that they have something really valuable, guess what? You may be targeted. And the question is, when you're being targeted, what was intent? What is what they were trying to get out of you? Were they successful in getting something that it was that valuable? In other words, it gives you the motive, right, of the particular attack. In general, random attacks, but you know what the motive is. Yes, some of those attacks is to steal credit cards. Okay, fine. Now we know the motive. But I feel comfortable, well, can I feel comfortable that I know that it was a random? Well, it doesn't matter whether you were a random or not if your credit card was stolen, right? You don't feel lucky anyway. But at least you know that you were not targeted, correct? There is always the possibility that then you can identify the attacker, right? But in internet attacks and all that, they're highly distributed. They come through many different channels. It's very difficult to determine unless you can correlate with many other incidents, you can correlate with many other data, that then you can uniquely identify that this attack was really done by a particular individual, more when that individual may reside on the other side of the world, right? It's not even nearby. One of the things that you're also looking on the incident reconstruction is the actions, inactions, and reactions. In other words, what is what they came in and put on your computer? What is what they took out of it? What is what they removed? And what is what they changed? So as you start looking at evidence, remember, you're looking at a lot of stuff, right? But sometimes you ask yourself, is there something missing out of the information that it should be there, right? And why was it removed, or why was something changed? Right? I mean, things doesn't happen just for happening. There has to be a reason behind any one of those actions. And that one is something that is also part of the investigation, trying to identify it as you're going through the information, what is really what happened. Evidence dynamics, right? Incident reconstruction is also helps you to identify all of those external influences or everything that somehow it can change, relocate, obscures, obliterate evidence, but it's regardless of intent. That's what we were talking initially. If you wait too long, what happened with the information? It's changing. Now, can you identify why was it changing? Can you identify if there were processes within your computer that made those things change? One of your worst enemies, well, not worst enemies, but one of the enemies of evidence preservation, or in case of an incident, is your antivirus. Why? The antivirus has a good intent. What is intent? Try to find virus on your computer. So once in a while, the antivirus goes and it does what? Scanning of all your files, correct? What happened during that scanning process? All your times of last access now had been modified, because every file now has been modified by who? By the antivirus. So you may have process. The same thing happened with a backup process. In some times where people do backups, the last thing that touched the systems were what? Was the backup. So that is one of those processes, right? That was not the intent to do it, but inadvertently is what? Is destroying some of the evidence, right? So slowly, a lot of the information that it may be there may start to degrade or may start to change just because there are other processes that they keep running, right? And they're natural process. That means they're there. And in fact, by the time that those processes were run, you probably at that time didn't even know that the incident had occurred, right? So don't feel guilty about it. The other one is, and you had to admit that, the reconstruction of that incident may not be possible. So in many cases, there is so much that you can do, but there is a point in which you cannot reconstruct many things. You have too many gaps in order to identify what happened, right? Because the limited amount of evidence that then you encounter, there's a lot amount of that it was modified or that it was changed. And that happened more often than what you may want to believe. That means in some processes, because of the dynamics of the systems, many of the incidents, you cannot reconstruct everything that happened, right? You may have an idea of what can happen, but you cannot really fully reconstruct it, but you don't have sufficient evidence in order to make really consistent, reconstruction or full reconstruction of what happened at every stage. Questions so far? No? Everyone's so quiet. Reporting. I think that one is the most important part. At the end, once that then you finish with everything, you had to write a report. That report is going to have, it has to have everything. It has to be a report that whoever is going to read it, right, needs to understand everything that then you did, how you did it. It should be able then to validate, at least for what you wrote, that indeed every step that you did, every effort, that you used the right tools in order to preserve the integrity of the information, that you did an objective analysis, right? To support every one of the conclusions that then you have evidence to support each one of them, correct? And it has to be understandable. Now, that may be the difficult part. Some of us that are a little bit more technical would like to write on a technical jargon, and you had to always remind yourself who the audience is going to be for that report, and make sure that you're conveying the right ideas, right? That there are no ambiguities in any one of your sentences, that there is no there cannot be any room for misunderstandings of what you're trying to say. And in some cases, and you never know when, you may have to be asked to provide expert testimony. It all depends where the investigation goes. And in some cases, you don't know where it is going to go. In some cases, you finish the investigation, turning that investigation to other individuals within your organization, and then at that point, they may decide whether they're going to proceed with some action, and depending on the action that they take, there may be some litigation afterwards, right? So you never know. In particular, when you're dealing with issues of personnel or violations of internal policies and things of that nature, you never know when something may be escalated later on to someone takes a legal action. In that case, you may be asked to testify, and so you may be questioning about your investigation, and you may become an expert witness. That's also something that is important, and we're going to see that one later, that when you build that capabilities within your organization, you need to make sure that that there's always one person in there that it can function in that role. And the smallest number of people that they get involved, the better, right? In one case, because that's nature. So, protocols and tools. Yes. Okay, so how much time do we have? Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Even early. Yes, okay. One of the things that then we have, right, on protocols, right, that we're talking about is that you need always to follow forensic protocols. It doesn't matter where you start. It doesn't matter at what moment of the investigation you're going to be dealing with. You always need to start with sound forensic protocols. There is a couple issues with the data acquisition, the data preservation, and the data analysis. The tools that the protocols, of course, that then you use is that you really need to document every step that then people are going to use. At every one of those, whether it's in the data acquisition, the data preservation, and the data analysis, these two in particular, you need to make sure that whoever is going to be dealing with it, whoever is going to be in charge, whoever is going to be coming in for the first time, need to have very well written instructions or how to do, when to do it, what not to do, right? All the time. You cannot just depend on individuals to remember what is going to be happening. And we have the tendency not to structure our investigations in that way. It's very easy for people just to jump and then try to collect something. But you really need to make an effort that people follow good directions, that people knows what to do at every step. The other part that is also important is for people to know what they're doing. You cannot go and do an investigation using a tool for the first time. So whatever you do it before, right? If you want to use another tool, use that tool beforehand. Why? Because the worst thing that is going to happen is going to happen, meaning that you go on, then you try to collect information with a tool that you have never used, and guess what? You're going to ruin everything. So it is very important for people to understand not only their processes and their procedures, but they're also their tools. It's not different than when we go to an emergency exercise, right? On disaster preparedness, remember that? That there is a disaster. Do you know what to do in a disaster? Well, we think that then we know what to do in a disaster. We've been training about it. If you have never trained for that, then you don't know what you're going to do. You don't know how you're going to react. An incident that has happened when you suddenly had to go and do an investigation, it may be very disruptive for an organization. All right? In many instances, a security incident in some of those organizations can be considered a disaster. So how do you deal with that? So you really need to be prepared. People need to have been trained. People need to have processes. They need to feel comfortable with the tools. They need to feel secure that they know what they're doing. And that requires practice, practice, and practice. So it's not uncommon that if you don't have many incidents, that when you are presented with one of those, you probably haven't used your tool in 6 months or in 3 months, and that suddenly you are dealing with that type of situation. And that's what management role is important. What is what I'm going to do next, right? I am going to outsource. Can I go to some other experts? All of those decisions, you also need to be trained for. You also need taken into consideration. The use of validated forensic tools. There are many tools that then you can find. There are some of the commercial tools, and the commercial tools are expensive. Some of those are much more expensive than others. Some of the other ones are open source tools. They're as good as some of the others, but require a slightly different level of skill. The question is, which one is the one that within your organization you're going to be doing the investment for? And either one of them require individuals to be trained, require individuals to continue to be trained, right? Tools change and change constantly. Why? Because the technology is changing. 3 years ago, iPods were not around. Now, iPods are everywhere, right? iPhones. iPods, yes, iPhones. So if now suddenly you had to do an acquisition on one of those new devices, are you trained to do them? Do you know how to extract that information and preserve it on the proper way as if it will be evidence, right? And if you're not, then you really need to take another look and say how then you're going to be responding to those incidents. But digital investigations, right, as we were talking about it here, there's one of those aspects that many people think that is something that then you do once, only when you need it. But they forget that there is something that is a skill or their abilities that then you need to maintain, and knowledge that you need to maintain current all the time. Because you never know when it's going to happen. So if you decided to go for one, you really need to decide and make decisions on what kind of capabilities you want to develop within your organization. That's something that we're going to be talking on the next presentation. And that is one of the reasons. Can you maintain the level of skills? Can you maintain the level of expertise within your own staff in order to do that type of analysis? And in some cases you can, in other times you may not. Let me see whether we are here. Okay. As we were saying before, once then you're looking with evidence, and let's talk a little bit more about it. We already talked about some of the transitory volatile evidence, and you're familiar with it, right? Do you have tools that allow you to collect that type of evidence? And the answer is yes. There is some tools that then you can use in order to collect, right, information that is in RAM, right? And you can capture it. If you have an incident and then you go with the right tool, you can capture it. What is the problem with that? Can you think about, suddenly you want to capture that information. That means that the incident, what? Just happened, right? You're really aware of something that is happening at that moment, and you really need to react on that, right? And then you really need to know that this is something that now you have to do. It is within the scope. Those decisions are decisions that are taken really rapidly, agree? Right? The other one that then we have is contact evidence. That one is something that you can probably collect. The police is probably much more familiar with that. That's tampering with something, right? Someone creates physical damage and they do something like that. And then usually people leave fingerprints and DNA and many other things behind. Blood if it was a piece of metal, right? And they scratch themselves. But when we're also looking for information a lot of interesting things that then you can find is transfer evidence, that is information that is contained on emails, digital documents, network traffic, and things like that. Transfer evidence is, for those of you that they have look a little bit more into forensic evidence, is part of what is called the Lockhart principle. That basically every time that there is an interaction between two systems, right, and something in between, the scene of the crime, there is something that is left behind by the attacker, someone that is taken by the victim, and everyone exchanges something. So everyone takes a little piece of everything else, correct? The same thing happened on the digital world. When a computer goes into another computer to launch an attack, it leaves something from that system in there in the form of information, and it takes something with it, right? That is another piece of information that it may be on the attacker's computer. So there is always information that is being transferred, or evidence that is being transferred between any one of the systems. Between the scene of the crime, in some cases, what is the scene of the crime in digital world? Well, every place where that information travels, from the network to the computers to the wireless to everything, every device where that information went through, is a device where a little piece of the attacker or a little piece of the victim probably is there, whoever you classify as the victim of the attacker, right? But on that exchange, that always happened. The question is, can you identify all that information, right? And can you interpret all that information correctly and relate all that? The most difficult part of that is making it what? Evidence. Agree? Can you validate about the integrity? Can you validate the authenticity of all that information, of all those sources of information? Now, if you look at an enterprise like Sagrado, where would you find, what would be good sources of evidence? Well, we already talked a little bit about it. One is all the authentication logs, right? Okay. How many types of authentication logs do you have? Well, different institutions, they have different systems. It's not uncommon that it's domain controllers for those ones that are on Windows, right? Every time that then you log in an infrastructure that is a window, you have that. Radios, VPNs, LDAPs, I mean, it's a bunch of characters that then you can mention it there, but all of those ones are systems that maintain logs about all of the activity, and every time that a user comes in and every time that a user leaves. In fact, some of the new systems in domain controllers depends on the way that they're configured your infrastructure. You can collect a tremendous amount of information about a user. What is the program that they use? What time he exit? So much information that you can get out of that is maintained on the logs. Network logs is probably one of the other sources of information that are used a lot. One of the problems with the end computers is that in some cases you cannot trust them, right? In many cases you probably don't want to trust them. For example, when you're talking about mobile devices, right? One of you use your, I use my personal computer, for example, I come in here, I connect, and I use my personal computer. What control has the organization on my personal computer? None. If you're using a computer that is from the organization, there is a lot more controls on the kind of things that then you can do. But when people are using their personal computers, they're using their iPhone, they're using their Android, they're using any one of those, their iPads. What kind of controls does the organization has on those devices? Very little. So if you want to collect evidence, and at some point when you know of an incident, one particular source of reliable information without having to invade somebody else's privacy, because remember, that's the other issue. You always have to be careful about what? Privacy, right? There's always the rights of an individual, so you always have to be thinking about it. So the network is the other place where you can find out a lot of information about what the traffic was generated, who the traffic was assigned to, and if you combine that one with some information that you may have about authentication logs, you may be able to get a very good picture of something that may have happened within your organization, all right? You have also applications and system logs, all right? An application, for example, is your email system. You authenticate, yes, you authenticate to the network. That's what happened here in Sagrada. You connect into the wireless network, and then you first authenticate to what? To get access to the wireless network. After that, then you can go to many other different locations, and then you may decide to go to Moodle, right? The learning management system. Okay, the learning management system may use probably a different authentication, but if not, they're also going to maintain its own logs. So the ones that are logs that are maintained specifically by the application, right? So now you can run some correlation if you're trying to see some activity that may have taken place. There is also, for example, if you go to the registration site, someone registered for classes. That system also maintains what? Maintains a tremendous amount of transactional logs. What courses did you register? When did you register? All of that. You dropped courses or you didn't? Did you pay or you did not pay? I think that was the other question, right? So you maintain, those ones are things that are important for the, in this case, the university. So there is a tremendous amount of information that then you can collect for activity that it takes place on those systems. If you look a little bit different at the network traffic, and this is something that you also had to be careful for some of the issues of privacy, is about what files were transferred. What is what really happened? You may not know to some extent what is happening in what is the content of that, but you may have a very good idea how big were those files, when were they transferred, right? So there is a lot of information within your own infrastructure, such as in Sagrado or in many other universities, where you can collect a tremendous amount of information and evidence if there is an incident that happened within your organization, right? If you happen about any other entity or what happened at your house or what happened to somebody else's, that one is a different story because you don't have those elements of the infrastructure. But remember that your ISPs are maintaining also logs of activity of the things that then you're doing, right? So there are logs everywhere. There are activity information about you as you move on the internet and as you move on the digital world about you every time that then you move. The question is to identify those sources, and that one depends on the investigation and the scope that then you do it. Now, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the tools, about the applications, about the software and all of that, you can go to one of the main sources, that is the NIST, right? The National Institute of Standards, right? And they have some very good publications, and they do some evaluations about the, and they have a lab that is the computer forensic tool testing. That one is important if you're interested to know what are the tools doing, what are the tools that then you can use for a particular analysis, right? Now, let me mention that if you're interested about the tools, if that one is what you want to do, you can spend a tremendous amount of time learning how to use one tool really well, all right? There is certification courses for people on tools, specific tools that are provided by the vendors. But the tools are, but I mean, the information that then you can extract with a tool is as good as then you know how to use that tool. In many cases, from the perspective of an investigator, the investigator is the one that they will have someone that he will go, in some cases he has to use the tool, but in some large organizations, they have technical staff that is trained in order to extract information that they need as it is defined or as it is scoped by the investigator. And then the role is basically to put all that analysis together, try to reconstruct what is happening, try to make some sense out of that, trying to find correlations, right? Between all of them. There is also, if you want to go in there, that means I give you all the sites, and you can see there is a pattern, right? www.nsrl.nis.gov. All right, and if you want to go to the National Software Reference Library, then you have the www.cftt.nist, if the computer forensic tool testing, and the computer forensic reference data sets. They provide sets of data, so to speak, that then you can use to validate whether a file or something within a particular system has been modified or not. So when you do an analysis, if you want to find out what files were modified, changed, altered within your system, one way to do it is to compare it with the equivalents of the files that they were not changed, how they will look like originally, and then you do a comparison between the two of them, and from then you extract anything that it was changed. So there is a big effort in order to provide data sets for all different systems and many other things that you can use for comparison and assist you on digital investigations. So the tools, some of the tools can do that comparison, and then it can eliminate a lot of the files or things that they were not changed. That helps you to identify what is really happening within your systems, all right? If you want to read a little bit more, most of the content about the forensic framework, the methodology, you want to read more, you can go back to look at this book. It's Digital Evidence and Computer Crime, Forensic Science, Computer and the Internet by Owen Casey. There is a third edition that is coming out. And it provides you with a lot of valuable information if you're interested in learning about the methodology, if you're interested to learning how to do it and why to do it. So one of the things that we try to emphasize, at least in the course that is provided by Sagrado, is how do you use this methodology, and then how do you apply this methodology when you do the analysis, let's say, on a Windows server? How do you apply this methodology when you do it on a Unix? How do you apply the methodology when you look at a network, right? How do you find the information? How do you interpret it? How do you correlate it? What is what you can correlate and what you cannot correlate? So the idea is the application of a framework into different environments. And there is also, for example, in the book, is the application of exactly the same framework as you apply that to mobile devices. So the framework is the same, right? The digital investigation, the forensic methodology is always the same, and then once then you learn that, then you apply that to different instances, so different devices, right, or situations. And of course, the same methodology, now you can apply it to anything. It doesn't have to be necessarily what? A digital investigation, right? The forensic principles and the forensic methodology applies equally to anything when you wanted to do a forensic analysis, okay? Questions? No? Yes?
You mentioned that one of the limitations was lack of data. Could excess data be also a limitation?
Correct. One of the things that then we're seeing now is that with large systems, you can get really overwhelmed with data. So at some point, right, too much is bad, right? And it's also too little.
So as a hacker, I could dump a lot of
Correct.
information and cover my tracks.
And then cover your tracks in that way. And that's one of the things that people are doing with the large number of viruses that are coming around. I mean, there is thousands of new viruses that they created every day. Do we have time to analyze all of them? So this is a case in which everyone becomes really overwhelmed with the amount of information that is being generated, and only a small fractions happening. And yes, there is a high probability that the really bad ones may go through and we didn't know what they're really doing. Why? Because then they overwhelm you with a tremendous amount of data. And it's not unusual. That one is a technique. You overwhelm, right? And how do you make sense out of all that? And it's much more difficult, right? But you know, those ones are techniques that people are using.
I just think you're with lawyers.
Yes, yes, that's a typical strategy, right? But you can see that means within the digital forensics, how can you generate data? I mean, if you think about it, how much data is a computer generating where you connect to the internet? The amount of logs that it generates every time that then you do a connection to the internet, right? The amount of files that it generates, the amount of entries on the network of the connections that then you do, the amount of, all of that is huge, right? Yes, there is one-liners. That means there is one line at a time that is being generated for everything that then you transfer. Every time that then you download a page from the internet, if it has 300 pictures, you see 300 different transactions that they took place, one for every picture, right? That can certainly overwhelm you. you're fortunate that we're fortunate that there's some tools that then we can use that help us to analyze that. But in general, it's a tremendous amount of information. Yes?
What are the limitations with the new cloud reality? Investigations and
Yes, that's one of the challenges. We're going to be looking at that one later on. That means, first of all, is when you go to the cloud and then you make contractual agreements with them, what arrangements have they been made in order to collect information that then you can use at any given time? What access was negotiated for you to have access to that information, right? So, and also you don't know where the cloud is anywhere. So there is a lot of information that you may not know where it's coming from, right? Can you collect that? Can they give you that information? Can they collect that information? So part of cloud computing, or part of outsourcing your services to the cloud, is really looking closely at the agreements that then you sign and looking at all of those aspects of security that then you may be concerned with. And one of those is that if there is a need for you to be able to do an investigation on something that happened with your application, what is available, what will be available to you, and that one is usually negotiated the contract with the application. So now someone talk about lawyers, and is that, do you have the people that are negotiating the contracts looking at what should be included on those contracts that will not limit you too severely, right? Your abilities to do that type of investigations in case that then you need them. So this is a balance that I think that people started to look at it, try to find out and try to define, and people are becoming very cautious. What applications I'm willing to move into the cloud? What applications I'm not willing to move into the cloud? And all of that one is because of those reasons, right? You lose a lot of control. Well, you may lose a lot of control, right? You may, in some cases, you may even gain something, but it has to be negotiated. It has to be clearly stated. If it's not on the contract, you may not get it, right? Right. Okay. Well, if nothing more, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. We're going to have a few minutes of a break, and then we're going to continue. All right? Thank you.